PowerPoint and webinar. This recording will be sent out to all participants. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint slide, and I'm going to hand things off to Dean Rieck, who is the Executive Director with the Buckeye Firearms Association, so that he can give you the meat and the bulk of today's presentation. This is us being collaborating with the firearm community. Dean, if you would like to go ahead and share your screen, please feel free.
Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. Can you see that?
Yes, we can, Dean. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll make it look pretty. So right off the bat, what I would like to do is to do a quick survey of everyone attending, just to find out what the knowledge level of people here are about firearms. So Shauna, could you launch that poll? This is entirely voluntary, but it's private. No one's going to know who answers the question or what your answer is. This is just for our information. And the question is, do you own any firearms?
Awesome.
And
so
I
do see some questions coming in, Dean, so I'll give it about a minute,
okay.
And then I will launch the results after.
So while you're thinking about that, and the reason that I'm asking is that when you're dealing with volunteers for organizations like this and for this sort of activity, you know, they're basically two different people. There's some who have some experience with firearms and there's some who don't. And today's presentation is really about learning how to talk to those who have firearms in a way that's going to be productive and in a way that's not going to be insulting or condescending or that's going to interfere with your ability to communicate. So if you could just go ahead and answer that question, yes or no, if you own any firearms. It's anonymous. We're not going to know who's answering or what your answer is.
And I have about 82% of people who voted, Dean. Would you like me to go ahead and share the results?
Sure, go right ahead.
All right. And here the results are for about 82% of the people who are on today's webinar.
Okay, that's good. And in fact, that's kind of interesting. We're going to do some statistics here in a moment on firearm ownership, and that really falls in line with the general population. So that's kind of neat that we have what appears to be a pretty good cross-section attending the webinar today. So just a little bit about myself. I am the Executive Director of Buckeye Firearms Association. And just so that you all know, I'm not somebody who really grew up with firearms. My family, I had some family in the country, and of course everybody out in rural areas owns firearms, but it really wasn't a gun family. So I didn't grow up hunting. I didn't grow up with firearms around me. This is something I came to later. And it was really just sort of a random occurrence. I attended a firearms class just out of sheer curiosity and found out on the range portion, the instructors thought I was a pretty good shot. And they said that I should maybe consider competing. And so I did that. And that's how I got started. It was actually not about hunting or self-defense or politics or any of that. It was just that it was an enjoyable activity, and that's how I got started. So in the gun world, that's kind of considered the nerdy way to get into guns, but that's how I got into it, and that was maybe 15, 20 years ago. So what I'd like to do today is present some information that many of you may not know, and the point of all of this, and I'm just going to go ahead and go to my first slide. This is an overview of the three different things we're going to go over today. And this is simply a way of coming at this issue from different angles. We're going to talk about how popular guns really are. We're going to talk about the gun laws, specifically in Ohio. And then we're going to talk about gun owner attitudes, which is really the point of all of this. But these other topics on how popular guns are and the gun laws also point to this, because I want to give you a good overview of how gun owners think. And it's important to point out that I'm not suggesting that everyone who owns a gun is going to conform with everything that I'm saying here. The goal is that when you're talking to people who own firearms or may own firearms, I want you to make sure that you're not tripping all over yourself and saying things that might interfere with your ability to communicate with that person. As an analogy, I would say that you're probably familiar with the suicide hotline, the National Suicide Hotline, and there's a special phone number for veterans, and there's a reason for that, because veterans view themselves differently than a lot of other people. They go through often very traumatic situations in their service, and they feel more comfortable talking to people who have some understanding about what they've been through. And so using that as an example, the information that I give you today is going to be all about your being able to have some understanding about gun owners and why they own firearms, so that you're not being all judgy with them, or you're not saying things that you think might be helpful but really are turning them off. So that's really where we're headed with all of this. And I'm not going to be political. This is not a debate. I'm not trying to prove a point or anything. I'm coming at this, I hope, as objectively as possible, just to help you understand the people that you may be talking to. So let's start out with gun popularity. Firearms are, if you don't own firearms and you're really not in that world, I consider this sort of something that's hidden in plain sight. Firearms in the United States are huge. And a very large portion of the population owns firearms, more than you may imagine. And I say that it's hidden in plain sight because I think of these little newspapers that you get in suburban areas. I live in Westerville, and like a lot of small suburban areas, we get a newspaper, and it's all about what's happening in Westerville. And they'll tell you what's going on in local schools and all the sports, football and soccer and golf and everything else. The one thing that you'll never see in there is anything about guns. And even though there are a lot of firearm activities and competition going on, you probably don't know, for example, that Ohio State University has a team that competes with firearms, and they're pretty good. That we've had people go to the Olympics, but that is not something that's generally talked about. It's not something that's in the news, and so while it's there and it's all around you, you may not be really aware of it. Over a third of the adult population owns a gun, and this was interesting because the poll we just took showed that about a third, in fact, if I remember the results, I think it said 33%, which is exactly a third of the attendees at this webinar. Over a third of the adult population in the United States owns a gun, and 40 to 50% have a gun in the home. So if you were to go, if you live in a suburban or urban area and you go outside and you're looking up and down the street, you could easily say that in every other home, there's at least one firearm. So you may not have thought about it that way, but guns are all around you, even though people don't always talk about it. In Ohio, and this is an estimate that I've done, in Ohio, there are approximately 4 million adult gun owners. Now, the way that I arrive at this is looking at some other statistical information about gun ownership in various states and taking that percentage and applying it to the population of Ohio, which is, I believe, about 11.5 million people. I think the last figure I saw was 11.6 million. And so I look at the percentage and do a simple calculation. And in Ohio, we have about 4 million adult gun owners. And that's actually a really large population. The National Rifle Association claims to have 4 or 5 million gun owners. And so we have, or members. In Ohio, we have about 4 million the equivalent of the entire membership of the NRA right here in Ohio. So as you can see, that's a really large portion of the population. And a lot of experts think that that might actually be on the low side, because all of these polls, there are no lists of gun owners in the United States. That's not legal. So all of these are self-identified. You have to ask people, just like we just did with you, do you own firearms? And so it's all self-reported. And we find on these kind of polls or these kind of surveys that people often underrepresent their ownership of firearms. So it very well could be more than 4 million in Ohio. Across the United States, it's been estimated, and again, these are sort of estimates taken from other estimates, but there are over 300 million guns in the United States, and a lot of this information comes from manufacturers. So, you know, we could easily say, if we're wondering how many actual physical firearms there are probably enough for every man, woman, and child in the entire country to have at least one firearm. That's a lot of guns. If you look at statistics for various nations around the world, the United States, I believe, has the highest rate of firearm ownership. It has more firearms in the population than any other country. So guns are everywhere. Now, what is it that people are doing with all of these guns? You know, often we see guns, and again, I don't want to get political about this, but this is often where a lot of the discussion is in the media, is it deals with politics. But what's actually going on with all these guns that people own? Well, a lot of it is just recreation or hunting. So a lot of you probably, even if you don't own firearms, you probably know people who hunt. Ohio is a destination location for white deer hunting. People come from all over the country, even all over the world, to hunt deer here in Ohio. And there's also just a lot of target shooting. Just going to the range and shooting at a piece of paper, or skeet shooting or things like that. It's recreational. And what's interesting is, if you look at other recreational activities, things like football, which are clearly very popular activities, target shooting and hunting combined are more popular in the United States than football. Again, it's not something you see discussed in the newspapers or on TV. You don't really hear about this. But if you look at these statistics, you might be surprised at how popular it really is. Here's another way of looking at it. Overall, shooting sports are more popular than golf, basketball, or tennis. Now, where does this statistic come from? This is actually from the retail industry. And as you can imagine, retailers, because they have to sell physical products and order things and put them on shelves, they have to keep track of these things really closely. So what the retail industry does is various organizations issue reports every year on what sells. How many basketballs do we sell? How many golf clubs do we sell? How many catcher's mitts do we sell? And so on. And you look at all of that statistical data, not just what people say, but what they're actually doing with their money. And you can find out what activities are popular. So if you look at hunting, target shooting, and all of those various sort of activities, all of those are more popular than golf, basketball, tennis, and many other activities that we consider to be quite popular. And again, this is hidden in plain sight. People all around you are participating in these activities, and they may be talking to each other about it, but they may not be talking to you about it. What are some other reasons for gun ownership? We've talked about hunting already. We've talked about recreation. One of the biggest things that leads to gun ownership these days is self-defense. So we're going to get into some of the laws and how that applies in Ohio. But a lot of the new firearms purchases that are happening right now are people who want to have a firearm to defend themselves if they need to. And they may want to carry the firearm, or they may want to just have this firearm in their home to put it in a safe, put it in a drawer beside their bed and whatever. A lot of gun ownership is just pure recreation. And there's job-related ownership. You have to think about police, security, um, officers who provide security in schools, for example, or for businesses. A lot of corporate headquarters have security. Sometimes those are private security forces. There are really a lot of reasons that people own firearms. And these are not just guys buying these. Actually, one of the fastest growing populations of gun owners today is women. They're buying guns at a much faster rate than they did in past decades. Now, here's something that I want you to remember, because when I first started working with some volunteers for suicide hotlines, I found that the way that they talked made it sound like, in their conversation, they were going to try to find out if a person owned a gun. And it always seemed to be in the singular. And what I wanted to remind everybody when I first started talking about this, and what I want to remind you about, is 2/3 of gun owners actually have more than one gun. So I don't want you to ever to assume that if you're talking to somebody, if there's some concern about a firearm in someone's home or that is accessible, don't assume that they just have one gun. If they just have a rifle for hunting, or they just have a gun for self-defense. 2/3 of gun owners have more than one gun. Some own really a spectacular number of firearms. I own 6 guns myself for various reasons. Some of those are for just purely recreational uses. Some I have from the time when I competed. It's just like golfers who have, they tend to collect golf clubs. Gun owners tend to collect guns. 6 is actually a very small number. I know people who have multiple safes full of guns in their homes, dozens, sometimes scores of guns in the home. So just keep that in mind, that if you're ever in a situation where you're wanting to put some distance between someone who's going through a crisis and the firearms that they have, don't assume that they only have one. There could be multiple firearms, and they could be in multiple locations all over their house. So that's just sort of a logistical thing to keep in mind when you're talking about that. So overall, my point here is that guns are popular. There are a lot of guns, and there are a lot of people who own guns. And you don't have to remember any of these statistics. Just keep that in mind, that this is not, it's not just a small, very rare part of our population that has guns. They're everywhere. Now, I want to talk a little bit about gun law. And I'm not wanting you to have to remember what all the laws are. That really isn't going to play into what you're doing. This is just another way to come at this topic, to show you how firearms are embedded in our culture, in our society. And guns are a core concept in American law. In fact, and most of you probably know this, in the Constitution, there are amendments enumerating certain rights. And the Second Amendment talks about the right to keep and bear arms. And what that means, keep and bear, sometimes misunderstood. All that really means is that there is a right, a personal right, to own guns and to carry guns. That's what keep and bear means. What you may not know is that in the Ohio Constitution, there is also something very similar in Article 1, Section 4. The people have the right to bear arms for their defense and security. In fact, if you look at the constitutions of all 50 states, 44 of those states have similar language in the amendments to their constitutions. So you may have heard of the Second Amendment. You probably have not heard of all of these amendments, but these form the very foundation of laws in our country. And the reason is that if you go back in history to the beginning of the United States, or even to the original colonies, where you had Europeans coming over as basically business groups. They were coming here to raise crops or, mill lumber or whatever it might be to send back to Europe. They were coming here as a very long journey. They were going to have to produce food. So they needed guns for hunting. They were going to need guns for self-defense. They were coming to a place where there weren't any stores, there was no law. They had to rely on themselves. Guns have been on this continent since the very beginning. So it's natural when you realize that the laws began with guns in this country in a way that they didn't in many other countries. The right of self-defense is also a core concept in law, and most of our laws in the United States are inherited from English law. So this idea of being able to defend yourself, or terms, you've probably heard these terms, castle doctrine or stand your ground. Castle doctrine sort of means exactly what it sounds like. This idea that your home is your castle, that is your domain. It's your private space and you have a right to defend it. That comes directly from English common law. And I don't want to get into all the technical details of this, but in Ohio, as in every other state in the country, there is a right of self-defense. It's not clearly defined in the law, but there is an understanding that every individual has a right to defend themselves, their family, or those who are in their care. Castle doctrine is something that we do have in Ohio. Castle doctrine differs from state to state. In Ohio, the form that it takes is that you have castle doctrine inside your home, in the living space of your home, and inside your car. Now, I know that sounds a little odd. You do not have castle doctrine in your garage. You do not have castle doctrine in your backyard. Interestingly, the way it's defined currently is that castle doctrine applies inside your living space in your home, or any place you happen to habitate. So if you're in a hotel room, or if you're visiting neighbors or whatever in the habitable portion of that abode, there is castle doctrine, and in a car that you own or that you're driving. And what castle doctrine means is that it just sort of gives you the presumption of innocence. If you use a firearm to defend yourself in that space, there's a presumption that you've done so correctly. Stand your ground is really castle doctrine that's expanded to every other location that you have a legal right to be. So currently there's not a legal stand your ground in Ohio, but if there were, all that would mean is that castle doctrine in your house expands to your garage, to your yard, to the sidewalk, to any place that you go where you're legally allowed to have a firearm. In the United States, we have unrestricted ownership in most places. In Ohio, there is complete unrestricted ownership. And what I mean by that is that there's no permit or license required. Now, there are some states, New Jersey, for example, which has some very strict laws with firearm ownership. Not only do you have to have a license or a permit in the state of New Jersey to carry a firearm, but just to buy a firearm, you have to have a permit. So the way it works in New Jersey, just so you have some idea, you have to actually decide what firearm you're going to buy. You have to know the serial number of that firearm. You have to get a permit to buy that firearm, that specific firearm. Then you buy it, and then you have to declare where you're going to store it and where you're going to use it. And you can only transport it from the place you bought it to the place you're going to store it. That's not the case in Ohio. In Ohio, it's pretty much, if you want a firearm and you're of legal age, which means you're at least 18 years old for a long gun, which is a rifle or a shotgun, or 21 years old for a handgun, and you're not a felon. So if you're old enough and you're not a criminal, you can buy a gun. It's just as simple as that. You'll go through a background check, but there is no permit or license of any kind required. Also in Ohio, we have something called preemption. Now, my legal friends would take me to task for using that word, but that's generally how it's referred to. When you hear gun preemption or firearms preemption in Ohio, what that means is most cities or villages or townships have something called home rule. So they're allowed to pass laws to manage things locally, which makes perfect sense. But in Ohio, there used to be different gun laws in every single city. So you could be perfectly in compliance. Like I'm here in Westerville. I could be a legal citizen owning a firearm here in Westerville, but I'm very close to the line of Columbus. I can walk through my neighborhood and cross into Columbus, and they used to have firearms bans. So I could be legal, and then I take a couple steps and suddenly it's illegal. So some years ago, about a dozen years ago or so, the Constitution was changed in Ohio, and it's in 9.68 of the Ohio Revised Code. And it basically says that we're going to have a uniformity of firearm laws across Ohio, and that cities cannot pass their own gun laws. So that's what's referred to as preemption. It's a preemption of home rule. And again, I don't want to get, if you have questions about some of these things, you can ask. I'm just trying to give you an overview of some of these laws and not get too deep into them. Also in Ohio, we have concealed carry, which I'm sure you're aware of because that tends to make the news a lot. And there is something called shall issue. So if you want to carry a concealed firearm, a concealed handgun specifically, you can apply for a license at a sheriff's office. There is one sheriff per county. There are 88 counties. So you can go to your sheriff in your county or to the sheriff in an adjacent county, apply for a license, and unless they have a really good reason to not approve that license, it will be approved. And you will then be able to carry a firearm concealed everywhere where guns are not prohibited. Interestingly, while you have to have a license to carry a gun concealed in Ohio, open carry is completely unrestricted. So if you have a handgun, for example, and you put it in a holster, put it on your belt, you can walk down the street without a license, without any kind of permit or with any other approval from officials. And as long as it's visible, it's perfectly legal. Now, just as a practical matter, depending on where you are, you might get hassled by the police. If you're in downtown Cleveland carrying a gun openly, a police officer may stop you and ask you what you're doing. If you're down south in Adams County and you're walking down the street without a firearm, they'll probably ask you, what are you doing? So the attitudes vary from place to place, but open carry is completely unrestricted. No licensing and no permits are required. You're only required to have a license if you're going to carry a handgun and if you're going to carry it concealed. Something else you should probably know is that Ohio has something called reciprocity, and that means that every other state, so all the other 49 states, if you live in one of those states and you're allowed to carry or possess a firearm, you can come to Ohio and your permit or your license will be recognized in Ohio. You'll be able to carry here in the state. All non-resident permits are honored. Now, if you have a license from the state of Ohio, I actually forget what the number's up to. I think it may be over 40 states now. So you can use your Ohio concealed handgun license, go to other states and carry in those states on that license, and the authorities will recognize that license. Now, I want to say something very briefly, and I know we're kind of really speeding through this. about how people purchase guns. And there are two different ways in the United States to purchase guns. And I'll keep my remarks just to Ohio. You could buy it commercially. You can buy guns at a store, a gun store or a gun range that sells guns, or you can buy it privately from somebody who's going to sell a gun. So commercially, that's just what it sounds like. You go to a gun store, you'll go through a background check. As long as you're old enough, as long as there's nothing on the background check that indicates that you're a criminal or prohibited from having a firearm, the transaction will go through. Currently, it takes up to 3 days, but usually, I'd say in 99% of the cases, it takes about 10 minutes for that background check to happen. And it's called the NICS check, NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Generally, it's just called NICS. And if you go through that and it comes through clear, you walk out, you basically purchase it like you would anything else. What a lot of people don't know is that private gun sales are also legal. You have to be licensed if you're in the business of selling guns. In other words, if you're selling guns all the time, if it's a business, you have to be licensed. If I have a firearm, let's say I have a shotgun, I don't want it anymore, and I want to sell that to Shauna, she says, yeah, I'd like that. And I can say, well, give me $200 for it, and it's yours. She gives me the $200, I give her the gun, and that's it. I don't need a license to do that. She does not need a permit to do that. It's a piece of personal property, and you can sell a firearm in that way. What I can't do is I can't do that every day. I can't go to people on a daily or weekly basis and be selling guns just all the time. Now, a natural question would be, well, how many guns can you sell and not be licensed? I honestly don't know. That is not well defined, but generally when someone's in the business of selling guns, it's pretty clear because they're doing it frequently. They're unloading dozens of guns, or they're going to gun shows and they're selling lots of guns. And clearly, under current law, that's someone who's supposed to be licensed to do that. But private gun sales, as long as they're not doing it as a business, is perfectly legal. So we've covered very quickly just some basic statistics showing how popular guns are. We've gone over some laws. And one of the reasons I wanted to go over those laws is just to show you that, this is not an odd activity. It's not rare. It's both popular, it's accepted in our society despite a lot of the political debate over it. It's something that people in America do. And what I want to cover now is to really get down to what we're really talking about and talk about gun owner attitudes. The picture that you're seeing right now is taken at a shoot that we do for youth. Every year, our foundation sponsors a youth shoot. And this is people who are kids who are part of various organizations like the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or whatever it might be. They're earning a badge, their shooting badge. They spend a weekend competing under adult supervision. They earn trophies and so on. There are competitions like this that happen all over the United States. It happens there's actually something called the Appleseed program or the Appleseed Project, where people are taught about American history and they compete. This is really, I'm saying it's as American as apple pie. Whatever your attitude on firearms may be, this is something that happens all the time. Lots of people own guns, youth, adults, men and women. Lots of people are doing gun stuff all the time, and they have a certain attitude about it. And as I said when we began, it's right in the Constitution. So what a lot of gun owners will tell you is that they believe it's their God-given right to own a gun. It's in the Constitution. It's part of what America is all about, and it's their right. So, when you're talking about firearms, and I realize that there are times when you may want to separate a gun owner from those guns temporarily while they're going through a difficult part of their life. you want to be very careful to remember that in their mind, this is their right. It's not a privilege. It's a right. So you need to be careful about how you talk about it. It's part of our culture. In addition, it's a traditional way of life. Guns have been with us since this country started. They've been with us since the first settlements came to the United States. It's deeply embedded in our language, in our law, in our culture, in our activities, and it's something that's all around you. This is also tied up in some attitudes about individualism and freedom. And we often forget sometimes when we're talking about laws and politics and so on, that everything in this country was designed around the individual. If you've ever read the Constitution, if you've ever read some of our laws, they generally are not talking about groups. They're talking about people, individuals, you, me, each person in this country. So a lot of gun owners tie their gun ownership to these ideas of individualism and freedom. They consider their firearms to be a very American thing. So when you're talking about their firearms, you have to keep in mind that this is often tied up in their ideas of how they view themselves and how they view this country, how they view their place in this country. This idea of standing on your own 2 feet. If you talk to people around the world, they'll tell you that Americans have a really unique viewpoint. A lot of countries in Europe, I used to live in Germany, and the attitude in Europe is much more collectivist. They see themselves as groups much more than they see themselves as individuals. And so if you live here in the United States and you haven't traveled a lot, you may not realize just how individualistic we really are. And that's an essential part of gun ownership. And it gets right down to the identity of who some people are. That sometimes firearms become a symbol for who that person is. You know, I am a gun owner. I'm somebody who owns firearms. I'm somebody who competes. I'm somebody who hunts. So you've got to be very careful when you're talking about firearms that you remember that they can take this very personally. So you want to be careful about not saying anything that's going to be in any way insulting or condescending to that person, because when you're talking about the guns, for many gun owners, you're talking about them. That's the way they see this in their mind. There's also an idea of distrust of government. Now, I'm not talking about conspiracy theories and all of this, but if you follow the news at all, there's always something in the news about somebody wanting to pass a law to ban guns or to limit the size of magazines that hold the bullets for guns, or to have this law or that law or whatever. And there are also politicians who pander for votes. So they're they're pandering for the liberal vote, the conservative vote, or whatever it might be. But in their mind, the government is not really something to be trusted, because they're always talking about laws of one kind or another. And this turns into sort of a victim attitude. Since the 60s, I think since the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, when a lot of the really harsh gun laws began to be passed in this country, there's been this sense that gun owners, people who were really thinking about their constitutional rights and thinking about how American that is, they have this idea of victimization. Look, they're out there, they're wanting to take my guns away. So again, when you're talking to people on the phone, you never want to come across like you're one of them, that you're one of these people who are wanting to take their guns. This is obviously not the time to get political or to give the wrong impression about what your motives are. And along with this, there's a suspicion of the medical profession, because honestly, in the past decade or so, there's been a lot of talk about firearms being a health issue or a public health crisis. The language on this has changed a lot. So as a volunteer manning a suicide prevention hotline, you might be lumped in with the medical profession, and there may be just built-in distrust in talking to you about firearms. So just keep that in mind. And here are some verbal triggers, just some words and phrases you should probably avoid. There's always talk of common sense gun laws. So just the phrase common sense is sort of become a trigger. For your own good, as in, let's get those guns out of your house. It's for your own good anyway. That can really be a big trigger. Assault weapons. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. In 1986, machine guns were banned in the United States. Since '86, there have been no machine guns manufactured for the public, only for the military. There are no assault weapons in public hands without a great deal of background checks and other things. It's a whole different tier, and you just can't go out and buy assault weapons. And then finally, why do you need? If you find yourself wanting to ask a question, why do you need all of those guns? Or why do you need that particular gun? That you're really going down a rabbit hole on that one. So please don't begin a question with anything like that. Anything that's going to make a gun owner think that you're casting judgment or that you're ignorant about them or their firearms or the way they feel, just be really careful about this idea of being ignorant or not knowing about guns. That's actually okay, and most gun owners don't mind if you don't know. Just don't act like you do know. Sometimes it's difficult to know what you don't know, but just be very careful. If you don't own guns, if you don't have a lot of experience in that area, please don't come across like you do know a lot. That's just a really big turnoff. Finally, I want to direct you to a really excellent resource. Now, don't try to copy down that really long URL. Just go to Google and search for America's Complex Relationship with Guns. This is a fairly recent study done by the Pew Research Center, and it's extraordinarily detailed on attitudes and beliefs about guns and gun owners. Look through that. I think it's a real eye-opener. So, and they really drill down into the details. So if you have a chance and you want to know more about this subject, please Google America's Complex Relationship with Guns. So just as a quick summary, guns are hugely popular. 2/3 of the population owns firearms, and almost half of households have at least one gun. Guns are legal. They're easily available, especially in Ohio. And gun ownership is cultural, and for some people is very, very personal. So that really concludes my presentation. I'm open to any questions that you might have. I'm not a lawyer, but I'll pretend to be one to answer your questions if you have any about the law. So Shauna, that wraps it up.
All right, awesome, Dean, thank you. So I do have a couple questions here, and anyone else who might have some questions burning in the back of your mind, please feel free to type them in right now. There's a question from an individual who's listening today, and she said, in reference to the background checks when it comes to buying firearms, this is an area of frustration for me. When my husband and myself go to an outdoor store and he purchases a new gun, his background check takes not even 15 minutes. However, when she is a social worker needs to get a background check, generally FBI and BCI, to get employment, it takes about 2 weeks to get back to my employer. Her question is, why is the NICS so much faster, and what's the difference in these two types of background checks?
The NICS check is it's based on a database, and various agencies provide information that goes into that database, and it's largely automated. And it's a very simple thing. You take somebody's information, and usually it's if you give your social security number, that's the most sure way for them to do it. And they match information that they have about you against the database to see if you've ever been convicted of a crime, if if there's any domestic violence or whatever it is. and it's set up to be fast. It's a system. It's sort of like with credit cards. If you have a good credit rating and you put your card in the little chip reader or you swipe it, if you have a really good credit history, it comes back really fast, approved. For others who don't, it takes longer, or sometimes their card is rejected. That's an automated system. So the NICS works very fast because of that. With a background check like you're talking about, and I've been through this kind of background checks, you actually will have individuals, human beings, who will go do very specific types of background checks and will be looking at information that is not necessarily the same as what's in the NICS background check. So there may be things that they're checking for that have nothing to do with legal firearm ownership. So those are two very different kind of background checks.
All right, that is helpful. Thank you, Dean. I have another question that just came in, and it says, is it true that most gun owners do believe in common sense gun control? Background checks be universal, ban of bump stocks, and mental health, and no fly list should not be able to get firearms. So those are examples.
Well, you got to be really careful when you do. A lot of that information is from surveys. And so, as you know, anybody who's done a lot of surveys, you can get whatever answer you want depending on how you ask the question. So if you ask the question, should people be allowed to own military type assault weapons? You'll get a very large response. People say no. The problem is that that question is badly worded. There are no military type assault weapons for sale. So if you ask the question in another way, do you believe that people should be able to have common rifles? There'll be a very large population of people who will say, yeah, sure. So it's all in how you ask the question and how much knowledge goes into asking those questions. So it really depends. The answer to your question depends on how you ask the questions of people. The polls can vary widely depending on who's doing it, how they answer the question, and what their motivations are.
There's another question that came in, Dean, and I think this is a great question. It asks, you discussed the wrong phrases to use when talking with gun owners. What suggestions do you have for discussing mental health and gun safety, especially for parents who refuse to secure firearms in the home?
Well, I think that I mean I'm not an expert at. I've been through some training on how to man a phone line for suicide, but I'm not an expert in this area. So exactly the way you should talk to somebody. I think that you should just come at it. It really isn't about talking about the guns. It's really talking about that person's situation and trying to be empathetic for what they're going through. And ultimately, it comes down to, if you're dealing with somebody who's just really difficult about that, I think the way that I would look at it is, and this is the way I've explained it to people, it's got to be sort of a really personal kind of conversation. If you've been out with somebody and they've had too much to drink, and you say to them, look, you've had just a little too much. I'm worried about you. How about you give me your keys? I'll call an Uber or a taxi, and I'll come see you tomorrow, and I'll give you your keys back. And everybody understands that. That's something that's considered empathetic. You're caring. You're trying to help them. When you're talking about firearms and you're wanting to temporarily separate that person or store firearms off-site, or get them to put their guns in a safe or whatever it might be, you got to find out first what the actual situation is. Are there kids in the house? Do other people have access, and so on? And talk to them in the same way. Don't make them feel bad because they have the guns, but just try to come at it from an empathetic point of view. I'm sure that there are some techniques and some questions you could ask that would be helpful, but unfortunately, I'm not the expert in exactly how you should speak to people. So I don't want to pretend like I am that expert.
Thank you, Dean. So I have like 3 questions right now in the chat box, but we need to let Ohio Moss share on their resources. Dean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but could I potentially email you those questions and let you give me your written responses to share with everyone who attended this webinar? That way everyone could get a copy of your responses.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
So I will do that for these questions that are coming in, because I want to make sure that Ohio Moss has time to share on some resources for communities. So with that being said, thank you, Dean. Any questions that were asked, I will make a copy of. We'll make sure that we get responses sent out to everyone. Todd and Justin, if you guys would like to go ahead and share your screen, I'd love to have you do that. And as Todd and Justin Trevino are getting ready to share their screen, I wanted to let you know that Justin Trevino is the medical director with the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, or Ohio Moss, and Todd Cecil is the patient access manager with Ohio Moss as well. So they're going to share with you some resources that Ohio Moss has available for means restriction efforts, as well as some resources that are available nationally. Thank you. And we can see your screen, so you look great.
All right. I was speaking on mute, but now I think we're unmuted. So thank you so much for asking us here. And I learned quite a bit from Dean's presentation. So I think very valuable. What we'd like to do, and I'm going to try to do it pretty quickly, is just set the table with a few statistics and a couple of thoughts, and then let Todd go into some resources we developed through a project called the Community Safety Project, which we named that for a purpose to look at community safety in a broader sense. I can't help but, listening to Dean's presentation, part of my responsibilities at the department include something called cultural competency, and I learned a lot about the culture of folks who own firearms. And I think it's so important that, in trying to help folks in general, that we respect who they are, what they are, and the culture that they come from. So I think this was said very well. This is, can be something very vital to someone's, identity and their lifestyle and all that. We got to respect that. What we're interested in is helping folks at very difficult times for them. So we want to talk a little bit about how you might prevent suicide by talking to people in a very respectful way about their gun ownership and how it's so important to secure them at difficult times. So if we look at suicide in Ohio, we know in 2016 that there were about 1,700 lives lost to suicide in Ohio, suicide being the 11th leading cause of death in the state. And the segue there is, firearms are they're unfortunately a very successful way to complete suicide. So those are the links we're trying to get to. We know that demographically, we're seeing a rise in suicide in those 45 to 64, and certainly very elder individuals are also at risk for higher suicide risk. Suicide can be anyone, any place, anytime, and I think that's important. None of us are immune. I think we're all about getting not only mental health professionals, but those in other social service agencies, schools, the general public to begin to recognize what are some signs of people in distress, and asking questions about, maybe someone that appears to be in distress, and are they, talking about life isn't worth living anymore? Are they actually saying things about wanting to end their life or just stop living, those sort of things. So we're trying to get that awareness out. We're trying to get not only professionals interested in helping, but, way beyond that scope. So, I think what we've done with this project is trying to get some of that education out, and then kind of mix that in with, if someone is in a place of great distress, how do we talk to them in a really respectful way about how do they secure their guns and ammunition and what's possible for them. I'd only go to where, Dean was unable to go to. If someone is at such high risk that we feel there's imminent danger, we as mental health professional, a health officer, police officer would take certain actions. But, there's very many times that we're in that gray zone where someone is distressed and we may need to talk to them, as Dina said, in a way that recognizes, what's important to them, and we want them to be safe. It's very empathic and very individualized. And, certainly if there's family that can help us with those conversations, that's a real plus. I'm going to let Todd go on with some of the specifics of our community safety project.
Yeah, hi, this is Todd Fiesel with Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So we undertook this project called the Community Safety Project, which involved Dean's organization and a number of other folks to help us sort of develop sort of this approach. How could we support organizations and communities that might want to do outreach in this area? So one of the first things that we developed is what we called our how-to guide, which there's a link there, and I know you'll be able to link to that when she sends out the slides, that we kind of put together with the team as to if somebody would want to start some sort of project, some sort of outreach effort, what could be questions might they want to consider, where would they find data, those kinds of things, to kind of work step by step through developing your own project. And you'll find that on our website at that link. We also worked very closely with Dean in developing these Rieck cards, and we have these available at our office. And if you get in touch with me, I can actually get your organization some of those for distribution. And the idea behind this was something that we could be left at a firearms dealer or a gun range or someplace where those that use firearms might come into contact with it, just to educate them on the risks of suicide, and particularly the role that firearms can play, and some warning signs that are on there, and some basic information in terms of how to get into touch with help and those kinds of things. So these Rieck cards, you'll see the front and back there on that slide, are available from our department. And it's something that might help quite a bit, actually, with the question about how to talk to somebody about securing firearms and how to have that conversation, is a free training that's available at the website for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. It's called CALM, Counseling on Access to Lethal Means. It's a free training, much like this one, that goes through kind of step by step. How do you have that conversation? What does that look like? And it has very good videos, actually, that shows those conversations taking place as sort of an example. We've taken it here and found it to be very, very valuable. We know they've updated it even recently. So encourage you to take it while it's still free. And this last slide basically gives you some basic contact information, how to get in touch with Dr. Trevino and myself. They're both our emails and my phone number there. And of course, shares with you. And if you're not aware, there is a crisis text line supported by the department where you can text, anybody can text 4HOPE to 741-741. I've known a lot of young people to prefer that as a method of communication versus calling the suicide prevention hotline there. And we do keep some stats on that, which has been very nice too, on the crisis text line in terms of how many callers and those kinds of things. So any other questions, you can always feel free to give me a call at that number that's on there. Anything related to the Community Safety Project or suicide prevention related, be glad to talk with anybody.
So I'm going to wrap things up here, but Todd, I wanted to know for the Rieck cards, for everyone that's on here, as we do have coalition representatives and loss teams, is there a cost to those, and can they download them, print their own, can they customize them? What are the parameters around their ability to use those?
So there is no cost. We do have them in bundles, I think of 100 here, but I can certainly separate out, numbers if they need fewer numbers than that, and mail those out to those organizations if they just get in touch with me. We talked about putting a version of it online eventually. The one that we currently have, though, would probably not print out well from what our communications department told us, but we may develop one that we could just load and people could print off on their own as well. But right now they could just reach out to me, and I can actually, we ordered quite a few. So I don't see we're going to run out anytime soon.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, everyone. So I know that people are starting to hop off, and that is completely fine. Thank you so much for joining today. I hope you found the presentations useful. As just a note, I also want to thank you to Dean with the Buckeye Firearms Association and Justin and Todd with Ohio Moss for your participation in the webinar. It was very informative and helpful. I will be sending everyone a recording from today's webinar, as well as both Ohio Moss's PowerPoint slide deck and the Buckeye Firearm Association slide deck. In addition, I will make sure that Dean has a chance to address some of the questions that were asked that we didn't get a chance to address on the webinar, and you can see those responses within that email as well. The last thing I wanted to mention is the next webinar hosted by the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation will be on Wednesday, May 29th at noon. And that webinar is going to be focused specifically for suicide prevention coalitions, looking at effective action planning in your communities and how your coalition can put together a good strategic plan. That will be hosted in collaboration with the Prevention Action Alliance. So thank you everyone for joining today. Please do keep your eyes out for that email with the additional questions, as I think there were some good ones there. And have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you, everyone.